All right, well, I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Good day and good morning. Thank you for making some time. This is the first Power Session webinar of 2023, and it's been quite a bit of a hiatus since our last one. Today, we'll be talking about identifying a least cost CO2 pathway. Um, at the end of the presentation, there'll be a period of questions and answers. You're welcome to put any questions you have into the chat, and Sarah's going to assist me in managing that at the end of the presentation. We'll also follow up with a link if you want to review the webinar in the future or send it. Um, that will be possible then. So today's topics are going to cover first CO2 targets and outlooks in Australia, some of the complexity and the detail there. Then we'll talk about some of the research results of our investigation into best practice pathways modeling. And then we'll finish with a brief case study of some pathways work that we've done recently. Now, the reason we chose CO2 pathways modeling is because the setting of CO2 targets and the identification of least cost pathways is one of the biggest challenges internationally and globally, with significant implications for government policy making, as well as the regulation of the industries themselves and associated business opportunities. When the first CO2 pathways modeling came out, it took a great deal of time and effort. It involved, the national science organizations, and it was really prohibitively costly for anybody but a federal government. With developments in technology, it has become more accessible and easier analysis to run. It has also, at the same time, increased in its accuracy, scope, coverage, and the kinds of abatement options that you can consider. So we thought this was a good time to raise people's awareness of these tools and these capabilities, so that we all can collectively try and foster the best possible decision making. Because as we identify lower cost ways of achieving lower CO2 in the future, we can look towards maybe improving those targets over time and minimizing costs on stakeholders. So first, let's talk about the targets and the outlooks. So what we have here are the current estimates of what the CO2 budget would look like for Australia under a 1.5 or a 2 C warming scenario. This was via the Climate College modeling results. And you can see that the current federal target is slightly above the 2-degree warming pathway. It does get to the same point by 2050, however. Now, we've also included the state CO2 targets. Unfortunately, we haven't included the ACT, but they are the only jurisdiction, as far as I'm aware, that is aiming for anything other than a 2050 target at this stage. Mindful that Victoria's just announced an updated target. Now, in setting of these targets, and there is just a recent federal effort to revisit and review what those targets should be that has resulted in a change to federal targets. It's like all similar exercises, really based on trade-offs around costs. And you can see here what the different trajectories are with different additional measures added in. And ultimately, it boils down to how much more are these measures going to cost the community, and what is the political calculus involved. Now, figuring out what the marginal cost is of achieving a more stringent target is non-trivial. And that's because it covers the entire economy. And that spans, as you can see here, agriculture, mining, manufacturing, electricity, construction, transport, etc. And gaining an understanding of the current sources of emissions, as well as what the cost of alternative abatement options it can be quite a lot of work, um, and that has to date really challenged these efforts, but as more and more jurisdictions are looking at this, not just um, the at the international level or even at the federal level, but increasingly we're seeing states in Australia and in the U.S. doing their own assessment, and by virtue of this, helping develop capacity and capability in the industry for doing it more accurately at lower cost. Now here's just I guess a more detailed view showing the forecast emissions by sector in Australia, generally heading downwards, which is good, not necessarily at the target that you ultimately need for the degrees of warming that we're aiming to achieve. Bottom left, it says emissions waste by waste segment, but really that's by transportation segment. You can see, with the exception of passenger vehicles, that sector is actually forecast to increase its emissions over time, at least till about 2030, when a decline is started to be expected, presumably as a result of electrification for the most part. We have emissions for by waste segment as well, and here you can see the biggest expected change is going to be due to waste and landfill. Now, anybody who spends any time in any of these sectors understands how challenging it is to estimate future demand, let alone future emissions, and then ultimately what the alternative costs of emissions reductions might be. What are people doing? Well, for this, we turn to a review that we did recently to look at what are the different ways that CO2 pathways are being modeled. And what was interesting to me was that there actually weren't that many. And now this was a North American study, really a US study, and we were able to identify 5 ultimately, but we ended up dropping one just because there was not enough information available about it. And so we have the pathways study that was conducted for the state of California. We have the energy pathways study, and which I think is in the Northwest. And then we also have the one that was done for New York. And then by comparison, we've put in our own carbon simulator just to provide a comparison benchmark. Now, the reason we've broken this up by methodology is to just give a sense of how they vary. Most of these markets, as you can see here, are based on a bottom-up, what they call stock and rollover or turnover model. And that's where you actually have a model that lists every single unit involved. So if you're doing transport, it's counting every single vehicle. If you're doing buildings, it's counting every single building. And for power systems, there are less power stations to keep track of. But it really seems to be the industry standard for how do you model what the forecast emissions and the impact of various abatements might be. Now, when you get to technology adoption, that's where you start to see a slight difference in how the pathways models are working, and that's generally a reflection of where they've come from. So in the first 3, we see that it's user-defined scenario input. So the assumption about how technology is adopted is really a top-down scenario assumption. We're going to assume that we can diffuse, let's say, heavy-duty fuel cell trucks. We're going to hit 50% in 10 years' time. And presumably those assumptions are based on some kind of understanding of what's reasonable. The way that we do it at Energeia is slightly different. We actually base our uptake assumptions on historical calibrated demand functions, which are really based on what the economists would call revealed preference, i.e., historically, given a certain level of financial incentive and other qualitative factors and quantitative factors, what has been the historical adoption of that technology. And we do it by sector. So whether it's appliances and buildings or equipment or transportation or behind the meter resources, it's all based on historical adoption rates. And I think that that's gives you a little bit more accuracy in what's possible than just looking at stock and turnover models, which bring realism by virtue of the fact of understanding growth rates, understanding replacement rates. Now, in terms of the technology adoption drivers, or how these models project the emissions over time, Usually, you can see the first three, it's either via least cost or user defined. So you set the model and tell it to tell you which of the combination of abatement options is going to be least cost, or you can specifically set what abatement options there are, and it can tell you what the cost of that is. The way that we approach this is really looking at the demand function, the technology availability, and the technology costs over time. And so we project based on certain settings, things like, well, what sort of incentive levels are you going to put out there? What is our views of future technology availability? Now, in terms of the key outputs, I think there again we see a lot of commonality. Best practice in this space is to generate hourly, or in Australia at least half hourly. And I'm not sure you're going to need to do 5 minutes, but maybe that's necessary. Estimates of what the electricity or gas consumption profile is going to look like, how much any sort of input fuel costs are going to be on an hourly basis, where that's significant, for example, natural gas industry, and then the greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason for that is increasingly many jurisdictions are moving beyond net zero carbon to actually 24/7, which is, every hour has to be abated, and sort of pushing out carbon to some other jurisdiction via exports is really not going to be a solution in the long term. And of course, you want to generate what your annual values are as well. But I think one of the key things I was surprised to see everybody doing, or at least for the hourly energy demand, as being something that's now, I think, industry best practice. So the other thing, so these are methodologically, how do these models operate? When you turn to the scope of the emissions, here there's also a lot of overlap. You can see that different levels of granularity in transport, the buildings, waste, the electricity system, and natural gas. In transport, road transport's by far the most common source of emissions. Not everybody is also looking at rail, aviation, marine, and military. You see one study is looking at military. Our experience is it's very difficult to find information about military emissions, and so we haven't included that to date. Residential, I mean, the buildings are pretty uniform across all of the examples. On the waste side, we focus on waste as a potential source of zero carbon fuel, as well as the emissions themselves. We've included here biological treatment because it was in a best practice framework that we reviewed, but you see here that nobody is looking at biological treatment as part of their modeling sources. You got electricity, that's largely covered in natural gas, the different kinds of ways that you could decarbonize natural gas. So turning to the reduction options, and this isn't a comprehensive list, but this is, I guess, sort of an illustrative list of what is considered in each of the sectors for its abatement potential. You can see, transitioning transport to either battery electric or some kind of hybrid or fuel cells is pretty common, although there are some drop-in zero carbon options here with renewable diesel and ultimately renewable diesel and presumably renewable CNG and LNG, although you can use it as a I guess a bridging fuel source. Buildings, a lot of it's all about heat pumps and energy efficiency, which is what most of this is describing. Electricity, renewable energy, how are we going to deal with dispatchability and storage, but also you're seeing fuel cells and zero carbon combustion, whether it's renewable natural gas or green hydrogen. Finally, on the oil and gas side of things, looking for different zero carbon alternatives to what's currently running through pipelines, for example, and in waste, the potential for turning more of that into biomass and biogas. So now turning to an example of how we've applied this model and some of the insights that we've been able to get. We're going to walk quickly through buildings, transport, and then some power system optimizations as well, just to give you a flavor of how this sort of modeling plays out. What are some of the key results and intermediate results, and how might they be of interest as for anybody who's looking to either develop their own pathways modeling or to consider whether targets or the pathways themselves could be maybe re-optimized. So here, what we're looking at, it's really the three things that the models, and this is looking at our building sector abatement options. Let's start with the cumulative CO2 supply cost curve. Now, one of the best reasons, in my view, for using a stock and turnover model is that it really keeps you honest around, well, what is ultimately the maximum amount of abatement you can get from these sectors. So it's not some kind of top down, well, we think it's whatever it is. And by doing that, you get a little bit more realism that there's initially more emissions to be abated, but as those appliances and end uses get converted, there's less and less replacing over time. And these things can be impacted by changes in standards and regulations, maybe not allowing new and replacement to occur. It can also be guided by the level of incentives, but ultimately, this is looking at 100% conversion. This is your upper limit to what the total supply cost curve is, and then you reduce it based on whatever scenario you're modeling. The second most important element of the analysis is up here, and how much you're paying per MMT of CO2 over time. And you can see water heating, you're paying, you're starting with the easiest stuff first. The highest, best ROIs are being adopted, but over time it starts to level out as more marginal options are left remaining. You've got space heating and cooking. They have net real costs, but that's declining over time. Now, this is all a reflection of what future technology price outlook you've got for these technologies, and I would say you shouldn't underestimate the importance of work around what do we think the future technology costs are going to be. And there's a lot of research out there, and it's being updated all the time. So it's really important to use the latest and greatest that's out there, because it is moving all the time. Now, if you bring the potential supply and the potential cost of that supply together, you can create a supply cost curve. And this is something you've seen, I'm sure, in the Australian and U.S. examples. McKinsey's got a very famous CO2 supply cost curve. But I think what people don't necessarily understand is that this supply cost curve actually evolves over time. And for a given year, it's going to be very different depending on if we're looking at 2030 or 2035 or 2025. What we're showing here is on a present value basis, that there's a certain amount of water heating abatement that could be achieved per year, and it's in a negative negative cost, just because it's cheaper in this environment given the alternatives. Then you've got space heating, and then you've got cooking as a slightly higher marginal source of CO2 abatement. Now, let's turn to transport. So you can see here, same basic layout. Start with the supply cost curves. Here we're seeing passenger vehicles and trucks as being a source of CO2 emissions abatement over time. The passenger vehicles are starting to level out over time as they get towards 2050. Trucks a little bit slower. And then buses, which there's just not as much emissions from those relative to these two other vehicle classes. In terms of the cost of abatement, what's interesting, and this was actually a big realization during the study, was that buses were really expensive. Now, when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. They're really heavy and they use a lot of batteries, and batteries at the moment are pretty expensive. So and also what the alternative cost is. This has remained relatively high in this particular modeling example, whereas trucks falls over time, and passenger vehicles, again, based on the assumptions around relative costs of the technology and also the electricity, tends to fall over time. Now, when we bring it all together, you see here that we've got a negative costs for converting passenger vehicles. This is considered on a life cycle basis, and that's really important to understand, because folks don't buy on a life cycle basis, and it may be that people buy it initially are going to pay a premium, and it's only over the lifetime of that vehicle it pays off, and that's got important policy implications for how you may want to incentivize the activity. Trucks is a net cost. But it's a small net cost, and you see buses here are at the end. Now, interestingly, most jurisdictions are focused on converting their buses. It's a very tends to be a fleet that they have control over because of the contracts for public service. And Also, one of the side benefits, which we're not showing here, is that you reduce tailpipe emissions in communities by converting buses. So I think that's one of the key drivers for why that's been a focus, one of them anyway. Now, when you bring these, now ultimately you need to bring together the supply cost curve for the whole economy when you're trying to really focus on what is the pathway. If we want to, so first of all, what are the costs of hitting different targets, and then which sort of programs do we want to focus on over the course of time, and also which technologies do we want to make investments in to bring that technology cost down. And that's been something I think Australia's been very strong about with its low emissions technology strategy, in identifying and focusing on those technologies that have the biggest potential for reduction or cost reduction. So that's fine for all of the end uses. We looked at transport, we looked at buildings. Now, putting it all on electricity, you then have to focus on what is the least cost way of meeting all of that additional demand. Now, in this particular model, now we have production cost models. We've got capacity expansion models. This was actually done with a linear solver, which basically every year just picked out what are the least cost additional resources that is going to help us meet this particular market. Now, this market isn't as complex as the NEM. It was a single market, didn't have regional interconnections. So it's a relatively simple model, but still very powerful when you're looking at, should we invest in more offshore wind or onshore wind, and the associated impacts on storage and the duration of storage. This was all brought together here, and you can see that over time, this market selected a pretty standard portfolio of utility solar, onshore wind, different 4-hour and 8-hour batteries, and some natural gas. But once they went to full zero carbon, the natural gas was kicked out, and in place of it, there was a lot more onshore wind, and also fuel cell operation as well, using either green hydrogen or some other kind of zero carbon fuel. You can see here that same view in dollar terms. Now, in the last 5 minutes, that's been a whole sort of planning exercise covering buildings, covering transport, and covering the power system, which covers most of that initial set of emissions for Australia, and is now much more tractable, given that we have these models at our fingertips, and they're much more, they've already been configured to the large part, and so what is involved is updating the scenario assumptions, and to the latest basically, and re-optimizing. So that brings us to the end of the formal session. I realize I think we've scheduled this in for a half hour, so let's see what we have in the questions and answers. One thing that we've also got at the end is a list of potential future topics. So I'll be asking everybody to vote on which ones they think are the most interesting. We may or may not be able to put them in that order, but I am keen to understand what people are thinking in terms of what is of most interest to this group. So thank you, and let's turn to questions. So first question from Andy was, will you be sharing the slides after? And Sarah's responded that we will be via email, also on the website. So Sandra has asked, why are those costs so much different, so different? I think, and you've suggested maybe due to differences in utilization. That could be an explanation. I think the trucks that we were presenting are not necessarily heavy duty trucks. They would be a mixture, and so they could, on average, just be more reflective of light duty pickups, which are not that far. Light duty commercial is not too far away from passenger vehicles, which could have brought that down. Now, if we were to break that up into the medium, heavy, and light duty vehicles, you'd probably see something a lot closer to the buses. I mean, right now, unless you're doing lots and lots of miles, which a lot of the long haul articulated trucks do, you're just gonna it's just not gonna stack up. Okay, Ben. The observation about cooking is interesting. Induction is more dollars, but provides amenity level of service closer to gas. How does the modeling capture those level of service preferences across sectors? Look, that's a really good question, and it's something we did some work on behalf of Infrastructure Victoria around the costs and benefits. And we've also done work for different state governments, and how you bring in things like internal air quality and the associated health benefits, or just the fact that you like boiling your water in a minute, which was one of the things I enjoy watching. It is more difficult. I think the health the health impacts are something that are a particular kind of additional cost that you could factor in here. It's really up to the person who's running the simulation. There's the amount that you pay for the appliances and associated installation and operation, but if there are additional offsetting or externality sort of costs, that can definitely be factored in to give you a more complete, I guess, view of the relative cost and benefits. So Sandra's, I'm surprised utility scale resources are more expensive than behind the meter. What would be necessary to turn that around? Oh, so that's a really big question, and it really is. It reflects the cost of service. So in some markets that we work in, distribution costs may be very high, and there might be a lot of augmentation that needs to occur, and behind the meter resources can help offset some of those costs, bringing its marginal cost down. So when we did that analysis, we actually looked at what was the offsetting, what was the incremental cost once you offset it with any of the other benefits, sort of like that health amenity for cooking. And so on a just if you were just thinking about making solar power from a rooftop and selling it to somebody on the high voltage grid, or having a utility scale solar, and there's nothing else considering, utility scale solar generally beats it, although CSIRO's cost curves and AMO's cost curves for behind the meter and utility are now very close, and I think even behind the meter is cheaper. So again, your assumptions drive all of this, but the challenge is bringing those assumptions together in an explicit way and in a systematic way, so you can then, I guess, really come to grips with the complexity and the options and try and do it in an integrated way. All right, James. Interesting, in electric markets, the behind the meter solar arrays are not being built. Does this account for transmission costs? So James, I should have been clearer in that the wholesale market we didn't include after we had done analysis around behind the meter resources, showing that given no other benefits were available and the cost of installation in this jurisdiction, which was much higher than say in Australia, that we only had to focus on utility scale resources for the wholesale market. Customer preferences being considered. Now that can be a hard one. I mean, as we said, we did revealed preference. So if customers are buying it in a certain way, then that's reflected in our uptake curves. If they've got other preferences that don't impact on their uptake decision, that can be more challenging. Also, people ask us all the time, well, how do you model irrational behavior? And if it's truly irrational, we tend to not model it very much. If it's sort of a behavioral bias, then that's something that you can bake into your adoption curve. So Julia, for transport, have you assumed that trucks are all switching to battery electric solutions? No, we don't. We actually, in our modeling anyway, we have the option of looking at zero carbon drop-in fuel replacements. So renewable diesel, for example, generally not the lowest cost option, or fuel cells over time, and it can be a lower cost option depending on your prognostication around the cost of fuel cells in vehicles, and also the cost of either green hydrogen or some other kind of fuel for them. Right. So Sandra was saying, I was meant to ask that utility scale resources are lower cost. And again, that's only a function of the particular jurisdiction. And we were able to rule out behind the meter resources in that particular case. All right, well, we are at the hour. So I know many of you have to get away. I want to say thank you very much. Please let us know if you have any questions, and I look forward to see you in the next webinar. And if you would be so kind as to do a quick vote as to which of the webinar series you would think to be most interesting, please do let us know. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.